Hello everyone, I'm Dan Firmager, a charities and not-for-profit audit senior at Creston Reeves. Today I'm joined by Richard Freeman, founder and CEO of Always Possible.
Hello.
Do you want to talk
I don't know
about
if we're
Always
doing
Possible?
I'll talk as we go.
Okay. Richard is a specialist in organisational strategy, social innovation, workforce development and systems leadership. Today, Richard has joined me to have a conversation about how charities could consider ESG and what it even is, how to communicate your charity's impact, and to discuss what some of the common challenges with impact reporting are. But before we get into all of that, Richard, I thought we'd start with what actually is ESG.
Thank you, Dan, and hello everybody. Lovely to be here. Really delighted to be invited as a little interloper into the Creston Reeves gang. Yes, as Dan said, so I run a consultancy called Always Possible, and we do a lot of work with all sectors and all shapes and sizes, but particularly recently trying to help charities and non-profits to rethink or to feel better equipped to be able to measure their impact beyond just the sort of services that they provide. So Dan said, what is ESG? Well, it stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. Apologies to those who live, sleep and breathe this, but it's still an often misunderstood or little understood sort of concept in many sectors. But at the moment it's often more aligned to corporate sectors or big private sector businesses are talking about ESG as a kind of replacement for corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility being the thing on the side that you do that looks great in your annual report. Some businesses don't do it at all, some do it really well and at scale, but the tide is turning a little bit to think about actually how do we embed best practice, how do we embed ethical decision making, how do we embed the way that we build responsible organisations from top to bottom in every sort of strategic decision that's being made, and how can that add to shareholder value by thinking of shareholders as one of a number of stakeholders. So ESG is looking at environmental, social and governance in a number of areas. Primarily, I'm not going to go through all of those up there, but I've given some examples. And although we're kind of looking particularly at environment today, I think it's important that these aren't seen as kind of siloed bits of the organisation that you kind of think about separately. Interestingly, I think in the charity sector, I'm finding far less knowledge or kind of conversations around ESG. I think often because there are some assumptions that charities are already delivering huge amounts of social value from the services that they're offering, which is obviously absolutely true. But when you start to look at actual organisational behaviours, what is it that staff or potential staff who are without charities competing in the marketplace to bring in are looking for when they want to work with an organisation? What about volunteers? What about the impact of owned assets, the supply chain? What about staff well-being? All of these different things come into play with ESG, and for once we kind of have a shared language about business in a way that I'm not sure has necessarily happened before. I think we've got a shared language between private sector, the voluntary sector and the public sector that are looking at ESG in the same way, that opens up lots of opportunities, I think, for more collaborative work, for more shared best practice, and a kind of understanding what a 21st century organisation can look like, whether, regardless of what kind of legal structure is behind it. But the key thing is moving to a more stakeholder value setup, of which shareholders are one. And in the charity sector, it's thinking about shareholders. You don't have the traditional shareholders, but you do have trustees, you do have funders, you do have people that are putting money into the organisation, and there's increasing pressure on charities. And we've done a lot. In COVID, there were a lot of quite big emergency contracts handed out to a number of charities that we're working with that suddenly see themselves expanding quite quickly. We work with Age UK down in the south coast, they've got 11 new contracts worth many millions of pounds very quickly because of the 800% demand in service need. So they had to get up and running, scale up, recruit lots of staff, deliver that work, and now they're being asked, rightly, because it's public money, what was the impact? What's the return on that money that we've invested in you? How have how has that every pound then turned into some additional money? That's how to think about that differently in terms of how they report. Of course, that's nothing new to the charity sector, but there's ways in which ESG can actually make that a little bit easier. Those of you that are in the charity sector in the room, you've probably got a theory of change, or you've heard of a theory of change. That's something that a lot of voluntary sector and non-for-profit organisations are now starting to build in. And the interesting thing about a theory of change is, I think traditionally they're done sort of whole organisations. So this is, why does this organisation exist and what change could it make through the services it provides? But it's becoming an increasingly interesting tool to actually look at different elements of the organisation in terms of, well, what is our environmental footprint through the services that we provide and through the kind of space we take up as an organisation. Looking at governance and thinking about, okay, what is it that we are? How do we behave as an organisation? What's our role within our community as an employer, not just as a service provider? And thinking also about kind of social in terms of skills, in terms of welfare. So theory of change models, which the charity sector have been much more familiar with than many in the corporate sector, can be used for different elements of the business, not just the whole thing. So there's a head start there, I think, and what I'm seeing is lots of charity sector organisations now helping the corporate sector to kind of think a little bit differently about how to measure things. So ESG, I think none of it's easy. A lot of it you're already going to be doing, but there's nothing easy about how to measure a lot of this. But you can start with your values, your mission, vision, values, policies, code of conduct. Are you recycling? What sort of are you using local providers for your supply chain? But all the way through to what we call Scope 3 ESG, which is much more around your indirect impact. What is it that your supply chain is doing? What is it that your service users or customers, if you're running charity shops, what are they then doing with the products and services that you're selling them? And so to be truly compliant with the kind of highest levels of ESG that you can, it's understanding every little ripple that your organisation has beyond just what it is that you're doing.
Thank you, Richard. I think it's fair to say that some people might be looking at that and thinking it's a bit daunting. Where do I start? But in reality, is it fair to say that charities are already doing a lot of the hard work? Perhaps there's just a bit of rethinking to do in the way that they present that to, we call it consumer, but any stakeholder of the charity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think charities are using a playbook because they exist to add value into the world beyond economics. Charities are set up in their governing documents to have a value towards the community that they serve and the community that they're building around whatever social gap they are filling. But I think what I've found working with a lot of charities, particularly in COVID, who are increasingly competing for funding, increasingly worried about kind of long-term sustainability and some of the pressures about cost of living, the environment crisis, all sorts of pushes and pulls that are now making all organisations rethink about what their future looks like. I think what's interesting now is how the charity sector can use its skills for measuring the direct outcomes of the work that it does in terms of its charitable aims, to now then thinking about what it does in terms of environmental, social and governance responsibility. So there's already skills, there's already tools, there's already knowledge within a charity to be able to measure some impact. But I think it's now about widening that and thinking about, okay, what's the wider value that an organisation can offer beyond just its core services. And so I think charities are in a really, really good position for that.
And when we're thinking about how we go about communicating this, we've seen the traditional glossy annual impact report. Is there something that charities are missing here, and is there a better way to go about communicating their achievements?
So my company's job is to help people work out what it is they're measuring. So what impact are they having beyond just their core business mission? And then how to measure that, because it's easy to say, well, we've done X, Y, Z and X, Y, Z happened in terms of the short term, but actually it's far more difficult to then measure what happens because of that. And I'll come to that in a second. But we help people design tools, adapt tools, learn from other organisations that have maybe been doing this for a bit longer. And then we help people shout about it and talk about it. And as you say, Dan, the kind of glossy annual report tends to be the place where charities and non-profit organisations shout about what they've been doing. But we're more interested in how people answer the so what question. So you've done X, Y, Z, you've done a lot of different activities, so what? What has that changed? What has been the ripple effect because of that? A couple of examples I want to show you. Lewes Football Club, down in Sussex, where I'm based. Some of you may be familiar with them. It's the first football club in the world to pay its female footballers the same as its male. First and only. And the net result within 2 seasons is that the female players are now just below the Women's Super League, and they beat Liverpool in the final match of the season. And the men's players are, dare I say, still languishing a little bit lower. And that transformation, by investing in its female players, by taking them seriously, by giving them an income that was equitable with the men's, which meant that they could reduce some of the other work that they were doing. They would be able to arrange things in a busy lives that meant they could have more hours training. They would be able to play at a different level. Meant that the success of that team rocketed really quickly. And all that happened was a decision about pay. All of the rest in terms of the training, the facilities, the pitch, the skills, were the same, but the transformation has been huge. But that led to, and was in conjunction with a huge number of other choices that Lewes Football Club made around its role within the community. Just a couple of things here. So they've been working on food surplus and food waste. They've set up a community garden. So it's one of the players there with arms outstretched, working with local composting organisations, local growers, because they've got quite a lot of pretty much unusable kind of grounds within the grounds that the club owns. Can't be used to play on, can't be used to practice on. So they turned that into a garden in which they're now supporting lots of different residents in terms of circular economy, and they're using the food in the club shop. They've also, they did a lot around free school meals. They're doing a lot around campaigns so that male fans are able to call out other male fans when they're when they see sexism or misogyny. A huge number of different small kind of micro initiatives that has a massive impact, but they can't always say what that impact is. And this is one of the challenges that we've been sort of talking to them about. So first and foremost, they're about football. It's just their 5 pillars that they've put in their sort of impact plan. And that's really important. So any organisation looking at ESG, you don't become about the ESG, it embeds it. So they're still about football. They're about financial sustainability. And they're about getting their own house in order in terms of administration, in terms of being the kind of best employer that they can be. All the general things that any sort of business would be looking at. And it's only 4 and 5 in their operating pillars in which they're talking about impact on fans in the community and impact on the world. Yet actually, even though it's the 4th and 5th priority, it's something that club is being known for because of the scale of the impact that they're having. But the impact is still talked about often in terms of what they're doing. So they're making decisions about pay, setting up a community garden, X, Y, Z. There's a whole list of things, and when you read their impact report, it's just a list of great stuff that they've done. So my challenge to them was, well, what are you changing? What's happening beyond your club because of all of this interesting stuff that you're doing? Is football changing? Is the town changing? And suddenly there's all these stories that are coming out, the conversations they're having with the FA, other football clubs that are calling them saying, we really like what we're doing here, there's something really interesting, we're a bit scared to do this, so how could you help us, slowly kind of walk through a different way of working? The local council decided, so the councillors decided that they were going to put a standing item order on their council meetings where they would look at whether there are basically giving councillors and other staff within the local authority the opportunity to talk about instances of sexism or misogyny from either gender that they were unhappy with, or instances of behaviour or planning or design or marketing that they thought was not inclusive or potentially discriminatory. By having that as a standing item on each meeting, it meant that people who wouldn't normally be able to voice this or have a place to do it would be able to say, actually, I think we could do this a little bit differently. Not aggressive, not campaigning, but just an opportunity to be able to say that. And they took that from Lewes Football Club's model. So without doing anything other than just demonstrating good practice and having conversations with local councillors, the council itself completely changed its own policy, which itself has had some change. But that's not captured in their impact report, which is just a glossy document that says this is what we've done. So our challenges to charities and all organisations, what are the ripple effects? What are those more intangible things? And there are ways of measuring that. But that's the stuff that people are going to be interested in. Very quickly, in terms of environment, we've been working with FareShare down in Sussex, and they're a food surplus distribution organisation. They take waste food from restaurants and supermarkets and redistribute it to community projects. Now, they've already got very, very high environmental credentials because of what they do and why they exist. But what they realised was that they're still using all their vehicles were diesel, and they were racking up huge numbers of road miles because they're having to go and collect excess, pies from that factory over there, take them over to this project, put them in this warehouse there, and they weren't thinking about the sort of ancillary outcomes on the impact of their work. So how much of their work is actually being cancelled out? So they decided to trial the electrification of a whole bunch of their vehicles, bikes and this van here. So they raised some money to do that and wanted to see what impact that would have. So we helped them measure not just what carbon emissions were they reducing, but also what about the training for staff? Their volunteers were being then trained how to use electric vehicles. Their vehicles were more quiet, so they could use them later at night. They could take them up different, they got these bikes, so they could actually get to places where their existing vehicles couldn't go. But then we also looked at what the impact in terms of charging and range and all that sort of stuff. But what was interesting about this is that they decided, rather than just have this as a kind of footnote in their impact report, oh, we've decided to electrify and here's a little section on it, they really looked at it in depth. So what has this changed in terms of our organisation? What could this change? How could we use this as a way to influence other charities that rely on vehicles all around the country? How could we help lower the cost of electric vehicles for charities in that position? And just by spinning the question a little bit and being a little bit more conscious, the impact they had was far, far bigger. And using the theory of change model, which they were using anyway, but just for this project, really helped them to be able to kind of double down and articulate what they were doing in a different way.
So I guess, just to finish us off, we've spoken a bit about ESG, what it is, the benefits of impact reporting, but there must be some challenges with that. I can think of one, is that charities will be sitting here thinking, we've already got funding issues, there's a lot of pressure on funding, how can we possibly afford to invest in this? So I guess my question to you is, what is the potential risk of not doing this?
Absolutely. There are a million reasons not to do things differently sometimes, and there are a million reasons not to do things that could potentially cost more money in the short term, and that sort of goes without saying. I think we are reaching a tipping point soon. I think every business is looking at the next 10 to 15 years and wondering at what point the cost of, particularly in terms of environmental sustainability, the cost of not looking at your energy supplier, of looking at the amount of emissions being produced by your supply chain and through travel, how much is that going to then be a much greater cost than in the investment that it might take to be making the changes now. The early adopters, but it's not even early adoption now, but the people that are taking it seriously at the moment are already starting to see the cost benefit of the change. And as you know, in the voluntary non-profit sector, again, I think you've already got a head start with so much of the thinking, so you don't have to, do so much persuading of your trustee board than perhaps an SME might have to do of its shareholder board. There's already tax advantages and so on that you can take advantage of. The reality is people aren't going to want to work with you, they're not going to want to volunteer with you, they're not going to want to fund you if you look like you're lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of just sort of 21st century thinking, in terms of playing your part and in terms of the impact that you have. So the more that you can be clear about what you're changing, why you're changing it, and how as an organisation you're being adaptive and innovative and resilient, the better it will be. And it does come down to how you talk about your work, I think. It doesn't take a huge amount of cost, money or imagination to rethink how you're reporting your impact. These examples here, they're all B Corp organisations. I would look to B Corps at the moment because they're doing some really exciting stuff about how they're talking about their impact. The Tony's Chocolonely one, I love their report because they talk about what they've got wrong. They're really open about where things have failed. Their mission is to reduce child labour at every stage of the chocolate sort of manufacturing journey. But they realised that one part of their supply chain last year had relied on some child labour. So half their report's talking about how they figured that out, how they noticed that, and then what they're now doing. Because they're like, if we are noticing that there's still that problem happening, then imagine what it's like elsewhere. And so something about being honest and being transparent about the processes you're going through and the change you're making, even if it's challenging, is actually something that's really commendable. And so you don't have to be getting it right all the time. And I sort of leave with this adage really that it's that shift in mindset. Doesn't have to be massive investment or a completely new strategy, but it's the shift in mindset about not just talking about what you're doing, but talking about what's happening because of what you're doing. Ask those questions. Okay, we've done this, we know that service was great, or we ran that event and these people turned up. So what? What did they go on and do? Have you asked them? Have you been able to see what learning they took away and what change that they've made in their behaviours because of what they engaged with you about? And it's actually just by asking more questions quite often that you can start to see that your impact is wider than you thought. Do you have one more or so?
I think we're running a little short on time, but I think that kind of summarises the scale of the topic. It really is a topic that we can go on about for ages, and I think we're only beginning to dip our toes in the water with this. But thank you very much for all of your time, and thank you for some of those insights. If anyone has any questions at all, then please do get in touch with Richard. I'm sure he's more than happy to help in any way that he can.